On the morning of August 7th, 1944, at 0530 hours, Technical Sergeant Frank Dinius crouched in a shallow foxhole atop Hill 314 near Mortain, France, his SCR-619 radio crackling with static as dawn broke over the Normandy countryside. At 23 years old, he was an artillery forward observer with the 230th Field Artillery Battalion, attached to the 30th Infantry Division's 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment. The humid air smelled of wet earth and cordite from yesterday's shelling, while morning mist clung to the slopes below his position like smoke from a dying fire. Beside him, Lieutenant Charles Bartz studied the roads through his binoculars, counting vehicle movements and marking coordinates on a rain-soaked map that had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases had begun to tear. Their observer post had been established less than 24 hours earlier, perched on the highest point overlooking the town of Mortain, a medieval village that commanded the roads leading west toward Avranches and the critical Allied supply corridor that fed General George Patton's Third Army, advancing into Brittany. Intelligence reports suggested German armor was massing somewhere in the forests to the east, but nobody knew exactly where or when they might attack. For weeks, American forces had been pushing inland from the Normandy beaches, their advance so rapid that supply lines struggled to keep pace with the mechanized columns racing toward Paris. The breakout from the hedgerow country had cost thousands of casualties, but it had shattered the German defensive line and opened the road to the French interior. Now, in early August, the entire German position in France was collapsing, with Wehrmacht units retreating toward the Seine River, while Allied aircraft hunted them mercilessly across open countryside. Victory seemed inevitable, a matter of weeks rather than months, and soldiers who had survived D-Day began allowing themselves to imagine going home before Christmas. But Adolf Hitler, watching the situation deteriorate from his headquarters in East Prussia, had ordered a counterattack that would demonstrate to the world that Germany still possessed the strength to change the course of the war. Operation Lüttich, named after the Belgian city where German forces had achieved victory in World War I, called for a massive armored thrust westward through Mortain toward Avranches, cutting off Patton's army and trapping 4 American divisions without supplies behind enemy lines. If successful, the operation would split the Allied front and force the Americans and British to negotiate a separate peace in the West, allowing Hitler to concentrate all remaining German strength against the Soviet advance from the east. The plan was audacious to the point of madness, requiring 8 panzer divisions to attack through terrain that favored defenders across roads that American artillery had already ranged and registered, against an enemy that possessed overwhelming air superiority and unlimited ammunition. German field commanders who studied the operational orders recognized them as fantasy, military planning divorced from battlefield reality, but Hitler's word was law, and objections meant dismissal, or worse. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. General Walter Warlimont, Deputy Chief of Staff at the German Armed Forces High Command, traveled personally to France to ensure Hitler's orders were executed without modification or delay. He met with Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commander of all German forces, in western France, in a bunker carved from solid rock and reinforced with timber beams stolen from abandoned French villages. Von Kluge argued that withdrawal to the Seine represented the only rational course of action, preserving German strength for defensive battles closer to the homeland. But Warlimont carried Hitler's explicit instructions: attack Mortain immediately, retake Avranches within 72 hours, destroy Patton's army before it could retreat. The assault would employ 2 panzer divisions from the Waffen-SS, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, and the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, along with the 2nd Panzer Division from the regular army and elements of the 116th Panzer Division. Supporting infantry would come from the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, veteran troops who had fought in Russia and knew how to coordinate armor and infantry in complex operations. Total strength approached 50,000 men, with nearly 300 tanks, a massive concentration of force by August 1944 standards, when German units typically operated at 50% strength, or less. American intelligence had intercepted and decoded German communications through the Ultra system. British cryptographers at Bletchley Park, reading Hitler's orders almost as quickly as von Kluge himself. General Omar Bradley, commanding all American ground forces in France, received word of the impending attack on August 4th, giving him 3 days to prepare defensive measures and position artillery to receive the German assault. He ordered the 30th Infantry Division, a National Guard unit from Tennessee and the Carolinas known as Old Hickory in honor of President Andrew Jackson, to take over positions at Mortain from the battle-weary 1st Infantry Division. The 30th had landed in Normandy on June 10th, 4 days after D-Day, and spent 2 months fighting through the hedgerow country where every field became a miniature fortress and casualties mounted with each yard of ground gained. By early August, the division had suffered nearly 3,000 casualties, but maintained its combat effectiveness through a steady stream of replacements drawn from training camps in England and the United States. The men were tired, their uniforms stained with mud and blood, but they remained capable of the kind of defensive fighting that would be required to stop a German armored attack. Lieutenant Colonel Eads Hardaway, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, established his command post in Mortain proper and deployed his companies across Hill 314 in a triangular defensive perimeter. Lieutenant Ralph Curley's E Company covered the southeastern approaches, Lieutenant Ronald Woody's G Company held the southwest, and Lieutenant Joseph Rees's K Company defended the northern sector. The infantrymen dug foxholes in the rocky soil, strung barbed wire across likely avenues of approach, and positioned their bazookas and machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire that would channel any German advance into predetermined killing zones. The artillery forward observer teams attached to Hardaway's battalion represented the most critical element of his defensive system. Sergeant Denius and Lieutenant Bartz from Battery C, along with Lieutenant Robert Weiss's team from Battery B, spent August 6th plotting artillery concentrations on every road junction, forest edge and open field within 5 miles of their position. They marked reference points on their maps with numbers that corresponded to specific grid coordinates, creating a library of pre-planned fire missions that could be called by simply radioing a code number to the Fire Direction Center 8 miles behind the front lines. The SCR-6-19 radio that Denius operated weighed 35 pounds and required a gasoline-powered generator that had to be hand-cranked every few hours to recharge its batteries. The set could transmit voice or Morse code across distances up to 5 miles in ideal conditions, though terrain and weather frequently reduced its effective range to half that distance. Forward observers learned to speak in abbreviated codes to reduce transmission time and minimize the chance of German radio intercept units locating their positions through direction finding. A complete fire mission could be called in 6 radio transmissions, taking less than 60 seconds from initial contact with the Fire Direction Center through confirmation that rounds were on the way. American artillery doctrine in World War II emphasized rapid, flexible fire support controlled by forward observers who accompanied infantry units and could see targets with their own eyes. This represented a fundamental change from World War I practices where artillery fired massive preparatory bombardments according to pre-planned schedules, unable to adjust their fire based on developing tactical situations. The new system depended entirely on radio communications and mathematically sophisticated fire direction centers that could calculate aiming data for multiple batteries simultaneously, allowing concentration of fire from dozens of guns on a single target within minutes of the observer's initial call. The 230th Field Artillery Battalion operated 12 M1 05mm howitzers organized in 3 4-gun batteries positioned in farmland 8 miles east of Mortain. Each gun could fire 25-pound high-explosive shells to ranges exceeding 7 miles with accuracy measured in yards rather than hundreds of yards. The howitzers fired indirectly, meaning their crews could not see the targets they engaged, but relied on forward observers to provide target coordinates and adjust fire based on where the rounds actually landed. This indirect fire capability meant artillery could suppress enemy positions that infantry could not reach with direct fire weapons, creating the possibility of destroying German formations before they ever came within rifle range of American defensive positions. Technical Sergeant Denius had completed artillery school at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where instructors drilled him in the mathematics of trajectory calculation and the procedures for calling fire missions under combat conditions. He learned that artillery effectiveness depended on speed, accuracy, and concentration of fire. Speed meant getting rounds on target before the enemy could take cover or change positions. Accuracy meant placing shells close enough to kill or suppress the target without wasting ammunition on empty terrain. Concentration meant bringing fire from multiple batteries onto a single target simultaneously, multiplying the destructive effect beyond what any single battery could achieve. The most devastating type of artillery mission was called time on target, a technique where multiple batteries calculated their firing times so that all shells arrived at the target at exactly the same moment. Studies conducted after World War I had demonstrated that most artillery casualties occurred in the first few seconds of a bombardment before soldiers could seek cover or go prone. After those initial impacts, casualty rates dropped by as much as 66% as troops reacted to the incoming fire. Time on target eliminated the warning that sequential firing provided, catching the enemy completely by surprise with a sudden, overwhelming concentration of explosives that left no time for defensive measures. American artillery battalions practiced TOT missions during training exercises in England, synchronizing their fire until they could reliably achieve plus or minus 3 seconds from the designated impact time. The technique required complex calculations that accounted for each battery's distance from the target, the time of flight for shells fired at different ranges, and the mechanical delays in each gun's firing sequence. Fire direction centers used specialized slide rules and charts to compute the exact moment each gun should fire, then transmitted these firing times to the battery commanders, who would execute the mission with stopwatch precision. At 0400 hours on August 7th, Sergeant Denius was awakened by a sound he initially mistook for distant thunder, a low rumbling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. He grabbed his binoculars and scanned the darkness to the east, seeing nothing but hearing the mechanical clatter of tracked vehicles moving through forest roads that American patrols had reported as empty the previous evening. Beside him, Lieutenant Bartz was already on the radio, reporting possible enemy movement to regiment, his voice calm but urgent, as he requested permission to call illumination rounds that would reveal whatever was moving in the darkness below their position. The regimental commander denied the request, concerned that illumination would reveal American positions and invite German artillery fire before the attack actually began. Instead, he ordered all units to maintain radio silence and wait for first light, when visibility would improve and the full scope of the German deployment would become apparent. The decision reflected standard doctrine that emphasized conservation of artillery ammunition and careful target selection, but it meant that Denius and Bartz would spend the next 90 minutes listening to the sounds of a major German attack developing while unable to do anything to disrupt it. At 0530, the German artillery preparation began with a concentrated barrage that fell primarily on American positions north and south of Mortain. The shells, exploding in tree bursts that sent lethal fragments of steel and splintered wood in all directions. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes and involved hundreds of guns firing thousands of shells, the largest German artillery concentration on the Western Front since the Normandy landings 2 months earlier. The noise was overwhelming, a continuous roar that made conversation impossible and left men's ears ringing for hours afterward, but the barrage achieved limited tactical effect because American infantry had dug deep foxholes with overhead cover that protected them from everything except direct hits. Sergeant Denius watched the shell burst through gaps in his foxhole's overhead cover, counting the seconds between flash and impact to estimate range and caliber. He recognized the flat trajectory and sharp crack of German 88mm guns, probably the famous flak guns that could engage both aircraft and ground targets with equal effectiveness. Mixed with these were the deeper thuds of 105mm and 150mm howitzers, firing from positions several miles behind the German front lines. The volume of fire suggested the Germans were committing significant artillery resources to the preliminary bombardment, weakening their ability to provide fire support during the actual assault phase, when their tanks and infantry would be most vulnerable. At 0700 hours, the German artillery lifted suddenly, the abrupt silence more disorienting than the noise had been. Denius immediately grabbed his binoculars and began scanning the approaches to Hill 314, knowing that the end of the bombardment meant the ground assault was about to begin. What he saw made his hands shake as he reached for the radio handset. Emerging from the morning mist like ships from fog, columns of German tanks were moving west along every road and trail. Visible from his position, their dark shapes unmistakable even at ranges exceeding 2 miles. Lieutenant Bartz was already on the radio, his voice tight with controlled urgency as he reported to the Fire Direction Center. "10, this is G35, fire mission over." The response came immediately. The battalion fire direction officer, acknowledging the call and waiting for target information. Bartz continued, reading from coordinates he had plotted the previous day. Grid, Echo Sierra 9er, 23945, enemy armor in column, moving west on main road. Estimate 30 vehicles. Fire for effect, over. The phrase fire for effect carried specific meaning in artillery doctrine, indicating that the target was positively identified and the observer wanted maximum firepower delivered immediately, without preliminary ranging shots. This represented a departure from standard procedure that normally called for adjustment rounds to verify the target location before committing the full battalion to the fire mission. But the circumstances of the German attack, with massive armor formations advancing in daylight across terrain the Americans had already registered, justified the immediate application of overwhelming force. The Fire Direction Center acknowledged Bartz's mission and immediately began calculating firing data for all 3 batteries of the 230th Field Artillery Battalion. Within 90 seconds, 12 howitzers received their firing commands, gun crews adjusting elevation and deflection while loaders rammed high-explosive shells into the breaches. The battery commanders synchronized their watches and confirmed their weapons were ready to fire on command, waiting for the precise moment calculated to achieve time-on-target impact. Sergeant Denius continued scanning the German column through his binoculars, estimating vehicle spacing and movement speed to provide Bartz with updated information in case the Fire Direction Center needed to adjust the impact point. He counted 37 tanks and self-propelled guns in the lead formation, with infantry riding on the vehicle's decks and additional trucks following behind, carrying supplies and ammunition. The entire column stretched for more than a mile, representing a massive concentration of German combat power that would overwhelm the American defenses if it reached Mortain intact. The first American shells arrived exactly 8 minutes after Bartz called the fire mission, 36 rounds impacting. Within a 3-second window along a 200-yard stretch of road where the German column was most densely concentrated, Denius watched through his binoculars as the explosions transformed the orderly advance into chaos, tanks swerving off the road to avoid the wall of fire, while infantry leapt from the vehicles and sought whatever cover the terrain provided. Several vehicles took direct hits, their ammunition exploding in secondary blasts that sent turrets tumbling through the air like children's toys. Bartz was already calling corrections, adjusting the fire slightly north to catch vehicles that had survived the initial barrage. "10, this is G35, add 100. Fire for effect, over." The Fire Direction Center acknowledged, and the process repeated. 12 more howitzers sending their shells toward the coordinates Bartz had specified. This time, the impact caught a group of vehicles that had pulled off the road, destroying at least 6 tanks and scattering the infantry that had been organizing to move forward on foot. The German advance along that particular road had been stopped, at least temporarily, by artillery fire that the attackers never saw coming and could not effectively counter. But Sergeant Denius knew this was only one column among many, and across the entire front, German armor was pushing west toward objectives that Hitler had designated as critical to the success of Operation Lüttich. The battle for Mortain had only just begun, and the artillery duel that would determine its outcome was entering a phase where every fire mission counted, and every minute of delay bought time for American reinforcements to arrive. By 0800 hours, the situation on Hill 314 had deteriorated from controlled defense to desperate survival. German forces had bypassed the main American positions and infiltrated through gaps in the defensive line. cutting off Lieutenant Colonel Hardaway's battalion from the regiment and isolating the forward observer teams who represented the only effective means of stopping the German advance. Radio communications remained functional, but the isolated companies faced a stark choice: hold their positions without resupply or reinforcement, or attempt a breakout that would abandon the high ground and surrender observation of the entire battlefield. Sergeant Denius and Lieutenant Bartz found themselves directing artillery fire against German formations that were now closer than 200 yards from their foxhole, near the minimum safe distance for high explosive shells fired from howitzers 8 miles away. The margin for error had evaporated, replaced by calculations where a single mistake in coordinates or a malfunction in a gun's firing mechanism would result in friendly fire casualties among the very infantry they were trying to protect. Every fire mission carried the risk of killing Americans, but failing to call fire meant certain overrun by German armor that was methodically reducing each defensive position. The SCR-619 radio had been operating continuously for 3 hours, its batteries draining faster than the hand-crank generator could recharge them. Denius monitored the power indicator needle, watching it drift toward the red zone that indicated imminent failure, knowing that losing radio contact with the fire direction center would transform their observer post from a critical battlefield asset into an isolated foxhole whose occupants would likely not survive the day. He had a backup battery, but switching batteries required shutting down the radio for 90 seconds. And 90 seconds could mean the difference between catching a German formation in the open or allowing it to reach cover where artillery would be ineffective. Lieutenant Bartz was calling another fire mission, his 4th in the past hour, directing fire against German infantry who were attempting to establish a machine gun position on the slope below their foxhole. M10, this is G35. Fire mission, Grid Echo Sierra Niner 189042. Enemy infantry in open. Approximately 5, 0 personnel. Fire for effect, over. The transmission was interrupted by small arms fire, bullets cracking overhead as German riflemen spotted the radio antenna and attempted to suppress the observer team with accurate rifle fire that forced both men to hunker deeper into their foxhole. The Fire Direction Center acknowledged the mission, but the response carried unwelcome information. Artillery ammunition expenditure had reached critical levels, with some batteries reporting less than 100 rounds remaining from the 1,000-round basic load they had started with 3 days earlier. The battalion commander had implemented ammunition conservation measures, limiting fire missions to targets that represented immediate threats to American positions and denying requests for harassing fire or area bombardment that might not achieve measurable results. Each fire mission now required justification, a brief explanation of why the target warranted the expenditure of perhaps 50 shells that could not be replaced until supply trucks fought their way forward through roads clogged with retreating civilians and damaged military vehicles. Bartz provided the justification without hesitation. M10, enemy infantry preparing assault on Hill 314, if not engaged, will overrun the observer post within minutes, requesting immediate fire, over. The Fire Direction Center approved the mission, and 4 minutes later, the first shells arrived, impacting among the German infantry with devastating effect. Denius watched through his binoculars as the enemy soldiers scattered, some running back toward their own lines, while others sought cover in shell craters and behind destroyed vehicles. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but both men understood that German commanders would continue probing the American defenses until they found a weak point or until the defenders exhausted their ammunition. By 0900 hours, the tactical situation had clarified into a pattern that would define the rest of the battle. German armor had succeeded in capturing portions of Mortain and several outlying villages, but American units on Hill 314 and several adjacent positions had held their ground, maintaining observation posts from which forward observers could direct artillery fire against any German movement in the valley below. The battle had become an artillery duel by proxy, with German tanks and infantry attempting to neutralize the American observers, while American howitzers pounded any German formation that exposed itself to observation. The German commanders recognized that destroying the American observer posts represented the key to breaking through the defensive line and resuming their advance toward Avranches. If they could blind the American artillery by killing or forcing the withdrawal of forward observers, German armor could maneuver freely and exploit gaps in the defensive positions that infantry alone could not hold. Several German units began concentrating their efforts against Hill 314 specifically, recognizing it as the highest point in the sector and therefore the most valuable observation post in the entire American defensive system. At 0930 hours, Sergeant Denius spotted a new German formation assembling in a tree line approximately 1,500 yards from his position. Through his binoculars, he counted vehicles and identified unit markings, recognizing the formation as elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, one of the elite Waffen-SS units that Hitler had committed to Operation Lüttich. The tanks were Mark IV Panzers and Panther tanks, medium and heavy armor equipped with 75mm and 88mm guns, capable of destroying any American tank at ranges exceeding a mile. Infantry in camouflage smocks moved between the vehicles, their discipline and tactical positioning indicating veteran troops who understood combined arms warfare. What made Denius's hands shake as he reached for his map was the size of the formation. He counted more than 40 vehicles, with infantry strength probably exceeding 300 men, all concentrated in an area smaller than a football field. The Germans were organizing for a coordinated assault, probably planning to advance behind a rolling artillery barrage that would suppress American defensive positions while the armor closed the distance. If the attack succeeded, Hill 314 would fall within the hour, and with it would go the observation capability that allowed American artillery to dominate the battlefield. Lieutenant Bartz saw what Denius had spotted and immediately understood the opportunity and the danger. A German formation of that size, concentrated in such a small area, represented the perfect target for a time-on-target mission. The kind of concentrated artillery strike that could destroy an entire attacking force in seconds. But calling such a mission meant committing virtually every artillery piece in range, expending hundreds of shells on a single target, and accepting the risk that other German formations might exploit the temporary gap in artillery coverage to advance elsewhere. Bartz grabbed the radio handset and keyed the microphone, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to request. "10, this is G35. Fire mission, over." The Fire Direction Center acknowledged, and Bartz continued with coordinates that he had memorized from the previous day's preparation. Grid, Echo Sierra 9, 209043. Enemy armor and infantry in assembly area, estimate 40 vehicles and 300 personnel. Request TOT mission, all available batteries, fire for effect, over. The radio remained silent for 15 seconds, an eternity in combat conditions where every moment's delay gave the enemy time to disperse or move to a different location. Denius knew the Fire Direction Center was consulting with the battalion commander, possibly even with division artillery, seeking approval for a mission that would commit extraordinary resources to a single target. Finally, the radio crackled to life with a response that would determine the course of the next 11 minutes. G35, this is M10, TOT mission approved. Stand by for time hack, over. What happened next represented American artillery doctrine functioning exactly as designed, a complex choreography of mathematics, radio communications, and mechanical precision that would deliver overwhelming firepower at a specific point in space and time. The Fire Direction Center calculated the optimal firing sequence for multiple battalions, not just the 230th Field Artillery Battalion, but also adjacent units from division artillery that could range the target coordinates Bartz had provided. Within 2 minutes, fire commands had been transmitted to 8 different batteries, representing more than 30 individual howitzers, their crews loading shells and adjusting their weapons according to data calculated at fire direction centers miles behind the front lines. Sergeant Denius kept his binoculars focused on the German assembly area, watching for any sign that the enemy had detected American preparations or decided to advance before the artillery could engage them. The Germans appeared oblivious, their officers moving between vehicles and presumably issuing orders for the planned assault. Infantry climbed onto the tank decks, securing their equipment and checking weapons in preparation for the advance. To Denius, watching through high-powered optics, they looked confident, even casual. Soldiers who had fought on the Russian front and probably considered the Americans inexperienced adversaries who would break under determined assault. At 0941 hours, the Fire Direction Center transmitted the time hack. All stations, this is M10, time on target 094530, acknowledge, over. Each battery commander acknowledged in sequence, confirming their weapons were ready and their firing times calculated. Bartz and Denius checked their watches against the transmitted time, synchronizing to the second with Fire Direction Centers they could not see, but had to trust with absolute faith. The next 4 minutes passed with agonizing slowness. Denius continued observing the target area, noting the arrival of additional vehicles that brought the German force to perhaps 350 personnel, nearly a full battalion. Bartz double-checked his coordinates against his map, verifying that the grid references he had transmitted matched the location of the German assembly area. A mistake at this stage, a transposed number or misidentified grid square, would waste the mission and possibly kill American infantry in adjacent positions. At 0945 hours and 30 seconds, the first shells arrived. The time-on-target bombardment that Sergeant Frank Denius witnessed through his binoculars represented one of the most devastating artillery strikes of World War II, a textbook example of concentrated firepower applied with surgical precision against a vulnerable target. In the span of 11 seconds, more than 120 high-explosive shells impacted within a 200-yard circle, each 25-pound warhead detonating with sufficient force to kill or wound any human being within 30 yards of the blast. The German formation simply ceased to exist as an organized military unit. Tanks and half-tracks were blown apart by direct hits, their thin top armor unable to withstand shells arriving from high trajectory angles. Infantry, caught in the open, died instantly from blast overpressure or from steel fragments that shredded human tissue with mechanical efficiency. The few survivors staggered away from the impact area in shock, their eardrums ruptured and their nervous systems traumatized by the sudden, overwhelming violence of industrial warfare applied without warning or mercy. Denius watched the entire event through his binoculars, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. One moment, he was observing an organized military formation preparing to attack. 11 seconds later, he was looking at a smoking crater field littered with destroyed vehicles and human remains, the transformation so rapid and complete that it seemed more like a magic trick than military action. The sound of the explosions reached his position several seconds after the visual impacts, a rolling thunder that echoed off the hillsides and announced to every soldier within 5 miles that something catastrophic had just occurred. Lieutenant Bartz was already on the radio, his voice shaking slightly as he reported the results. M10, this is G35, target destroyed. Estimate 350 enemy casualties. Assess battalion-sized unit combat ineffective, over. The Fire Direction Center acknowledged the report with professional calm that belied the significance of what had just been achieved. A single fire mission, lasting 11 seconds, had eliminated an entire German battalion and removed it from the order of battle more effectively than days of conventional infantry combat could have accomplished. The Germans did not attempt another major assault against Hill 314 that day. Word of the devastating artillery strike spread through the attacking formations, demoralizing troops who had survived the Russian front only to discover that American artillery could kill with efficiency that matched or exceeded anything the Red Army had demonstrated. German commanders recognized that continuing the attack toward Avranches meant accepting casualties they could not replace and losses of equipment that could not be rebuilt in the time remaining before Allied armies closed the encirclement that would trap all German forces in Normandy. Operation Lüttich, Hitler's grand counteroffensive that was supposed to split the Allied armies and change the course of the war, collapsed within 48 hours of its launch. German forces that had been committed to the attack found themselves trapped in the Falaise Pocket, a shrinking perimeter where Allied aircraft and artillery destroyed thousands of vehicles and killed or captured tens of thousands of soldiers. The battle for Normandy, which had begun on June 6th with the D-Day landings, effectively ended in mid-August with the destruction of German Army Group B as a coherent fighting force. Technical Sergeant Frank Denius survived the war and returned to Texas, where he eventually became a prominent attorney and civic leader. He rarely spoke about the artillery strike at Mortain, perhaps recognizing that 11 seconds of violence, however militarily significant, represented something too terrible to celebrate. Lieutenant Charles Bartz received the Silver Star for his actions on Hill 314. His citation, noting his courage under fire and his skill in directing artillery against overwhelming enemy forces. The three-word code that destroyed 350 Germans in 11 minutes was simply fire for effect, the standard artillery terminology that indicated an observer wanted maximum firepower delivered immediately without preliminary adjustment. But those three words, spoken at the right moment against the right target with the right artillery support, demonstrated the decisive impact that technology and training could achieve when applied with precision and courage. American artillery in World War II fired more than 15 million tons of ammunition, more than all other combatants combined, and that firepower represented one of the critical advantages that allowed Allied forces to defeat Germany despite often facing more experienced troops. Fighting on terrain they knew intimately, the battle at Mortain and Sergeant Denius's role in it illustrated how forward observers operating alone or in small teams could multiply American combat power far beyond what infantry courage and superior numbers could achieve alone. The Battle of Mortain has largely been overshadowed in popular memory by more famous engagements like D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, or the crossing of the Rhine. But military historians recognize it as one of the decisive moments of the Normandy campaign, the point where German offensive capability in France was finally and completely broken. Hill 314 remained in American hands throughout the battle, its observers continuing to direct fire against German formations until the enemy withdrew and the threat to Avranches was permanently eliminated. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.